Okay.
We're going to
start because our speaker is a little tentative and it's on now. We're not sure how long it's going to be on. So we're starting right on time. Also, John can talk. Welcome. Any day we have John Kuykendall with us is a good day. So thank you, John. John is beginning.
You should ask Lucy about that.
I know about that. I know. John is going to be talking with us for 3 Sundays on varieties of religious experience revisited. Mm-hmm. And today is our first day. There are 2 handouts. So if you don't have one, I'll get one to you. Just raise your hand and I'll do it in a minute. Also, Missy has asked me to make an announcement for the church Gun Violence Summit, equipping community members for prevention, safety, and trauma care. It's March 5, dinner's at 5:30, the program's at 6:30. I'm in the congregation house. So check that out. Registration ends March 4. Okay, John, thank you.
Thank you, Barry. First of all, we're going to have a couple of instances in which you have about 5 minutes or 6 minutes, 7 minutes to talk about a particular matter. And what I want is groups of either 2 or 3 people. If you're married to the person, it can't be 2. You got to have a third person. Everybody understands that. So if not, look around and figure out right now with whom you can talk. If you just got to be 4, that's all right. But you don't have much time, so about 3 would be enough. Look around and find yourself some people. You got it figured out? Okay. Good. Good, so good. Good. Y'all just talking with yourselves, man. Let's go ahead and get started. I want to confess, first of all, I'm way in on my depth, but it's something that I've been interested in for so many years. I thought I'd like to teach about it. The topic is a famous book, probably one of the 10 or 20 most influential books in the history of American religion. I've taught American religion for a number of years, and I use this book as a kind of an example in some of those courses. It's a little bit over the head with college sophomores, but I'm sure everybody's going to get it. It has to do with the area of psychology, and I am a church historian and not a psychologist, but I think probably we can make connections, and there's some of you in this room, I know at least 2 or 3, who know a lot more about that than I do, so be kind and try to be supportive as I move on. A person to whom I'm very closely connected said, "Why are you doing this?" And so it was suggested that I give a little prologue before the outline that you have before you, which I'm going to do very briefly. The latter quarter of the 19th century in American religion was a time of incredible ferment. From about the time of the Civil War on, there were all these ideas that bombarded the whole structure of American religion, especially American Christianity, especially American evangelical Christianity, especially American revivalistic Christianity. These ideas came from all different sorts of directions. As diverse as Darwin's Origin of Species, which was written a little bit earlier but didn't become current in the life of American nations until after the Civil War. And the second one was the emergence early on of the economic determinism, let's call it. The Marx and Engels came along and used Hegel's dialectic to say everything goes together this way, and finances, money, material things, really the determinant of the future of economics everywhere. This is all part of an incredible, diverse development of all the ideas, all the fields that we know of today as the social sciences. That was a term that somebody living around the Civil War would know what you're talking about. But now, if you look at it, you see things coming along like the sociology became a field. A man called William Graham Sumner, wrote a book called Folkways, in which he talked about religion as being primarily socially conditioned. Anthropologists were studying comparative religions and thereby wondering if truth wasn't a little bit relative. There wasn't one particular approach to religion. In history, the new criticism, the historical critical method of study, including study of the Bible, really challenged the traditional views of things. And among all of this, psychology, beginning in about 1870, became a discrete entity, field unto itself. Now, people have been psychologizing for a long time, all the way back to the Greeks and to the Egyptians. They were psychologizing, but all of a sudden it becomes a science. It becomes an empirical matter. And one of the first things that went on in all this was this particular document, The Varieties of Religious Experience. So now we can go to the outline that you have before you, and I'll begin to tell you what we're going to do. The Varieties of Religious Experience was written by a man called William James. He was one of the kind of public intellectuals of the period beginning about the 1880s and on to his death in 1910. As I indicated, he was a famous member of a famous family. One of the things somebody told me once was if you check on a person's intellectual acumen by when you say the James boy, they think you're talking about Jesse and Frank, and they think you're talking about William and Henry. The latter is what we're looking at right now. He came from a very affluent family. His father, who didn't have to work for a living, although later on the family fortunes began to fade somewhat. His father was a dabbler in religion himself. Particularly, he was interested in the theological and spiritual ideas of a man called Emanuel Swedenborg, who was a Swede who lived in the 18th century, and he was one of these people who dabbled in everything, including the fact that he was looking at religion from a particularly spiritual point of view. And a lot of people studied Swedenborg just as a kind of an aside. It was not in the mainstream of American religion at that time, but it was very popular. When I was working with my grandfather was a preacher, a very rock-ribbed Calvinist preacher. But when I was working in his library trying to distribute it, I came upon several books by Emanuel Swedenborg. Never quite knew why, because that wasn't who Grandpa was, but it was a part of the fabric of the culture at that time. James's brother, of course, was the novelist Henry James. We know about him. The family was particularly, during his early days, his early life, the family was sufficiently affluent that they spent lots of time in Europe, back and forth across the Atlantic. That must have been an influence on the way that he thought. When they were back in this country, he was exempted from the Civil War because of health reasons. Don't know exactly what that's all about, except that he suffered from depression off and on throughout his life, and that may have had something to do with it. At any rate, instead of being in the military, although he had a couple of brothers who were, he wound up following a kind of intellectual pilgrimage. First thing he wanted to do was to become a painter. I think his father I don't think that was house painting. I think it was something. His father got in the middle of that, so he was going to go to college, and he was going to study something by which he could make a living. And what he went to study was chemistry at Harvard, and he did that for a couple of years, and then he decided to switch to med school at Harvard. To do that in those days. And the only degree he ever got from any of these studies was an MD degree, which is really kind of unusual because of what he did. In the middle of med school, he decided to take a couple of years off. He spent 2 years in France and Germany, and while he was there, he developed an interest in this brand new study of psychology, and also he became very much interested in the aspects philosophy as well. His job, by which he made a living for most of his early life, was as an instructor at Harvard. He taught comparative physiology. And one reads this book that we're going to talk about with the kind of a sense of the fact that he thought as a physiologist even as he was looking at human phenomena. Well, he was one of the pioneers, as we know, of psychology as a science rather than psychology as a kind of mental philosophy. He began teaching psychology as early as 1875. He is said to have said on one occasion, the first lecture on psychology I ever heard was the first one I ever gave. And but he really is looked upon by many, not all, as the father of American psychology. He wrote two of the first textbooks on the subject, and those textbooks are common point in institutions of higher learning in this country for almost 20 years. The first one was the longer of the two, and the second was shorter, and it was spoken of by people that you know as you can read the James version or you can read the Jimmy version. But he really kind of set the parameters of psychology in this country. And as he was doing that, he more and more became interested in the philosophy of pragmatism, and he really focused upon pragmatism in his later life. He wrote a book not too long before he died on the philosophy of pragmatism, which kind of the standard text for that in psychology, in philosophy, for a number of decades. Now, the philosophy of pragmatism is a hard thing to get your arms around, but essentially what it means is that you can never exactly know the truth of an idea, but you can focus on the usefulness of the idea, what James often spoke of as the cash value of the idea. In other words, if it works, it must be okay. Now, I think that's a little simplistic, but that's the way the philosophy of pragmatism can really be described. Now, among his significant contributions, we say the father of American psychology with an asterisk beside it. We say he was certainly a major figure in the philosophy of pragmatism. And the third thing we would have to say is that he wrote the Varieties of Religious Experience. Varieties of Religious Experience, I was going to say this later, but I think I'll say it now, went through 21 editions in the first decade after it was published, just after the turn of the 20th century. Let me say just a word about where it came from. In the late 1880s and the mid 1880s, Adam Ward Gifford, who was a member of the bar in Scotland and a very prominent member of the landed gentry in Scotland, decided to give a major portion of his estate over to a particular project, which was to be an endowment at the four historic universities of Scotland. That would be Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Glasgow, and St Andrews. And he gave grants to each of those schools in order to set up a lectureship. Now, I was going to read you the first sentence of his indenture when he wrote his will, but it runs for about 13 lines. It has 22 commas in it. But the burden of it is that he's been interested. Maybe just read the first 4 lines. It's only one sentence, but it goes 13 lines. I've been for many years deeply and firmly convinced that, and felt that the true knowledge of God, that is, of the being, nature, and attributes of the infinite, of all, the old first and only cause, that is, the one and only substance of being, and the true and felt knowledge, not being nominal knowledge, of the relations of man and the universe, and the true foundation of all ethics and law, if he goes on from there. But the point is, he wanted to give a bunch of money to these 3 universities, and he wanted to talk about what he referred to as a natural religion. Now, oftentimes, it's almost a synonymous use of that as natural theology, and it tends to be close to religion, which is revelation free. That is, no sacred text, no expectation of any word from on high, but looking at the reason-informed theology, and most often it is associated with whether or not you can prove who God is, that there is a God, and who God is, by reference to natural reason and looking at the world around you. And that's been a bone of contention in Christian theology probably ever since the very beginning. Most recently, there was a famous encounter, really an argument, a public argument between two of the greatest theologians of the 20th century, Karl Barth and Emil Brunner, who both of whom were Scott or in Switzerland. And these two guys got into a fist fight, not literal, a fist fight over this, in which eventually Karl Barth wanted to have the last word, published an article in one of the journals of religion, which began with the word "thine." In other words, you did wrong. Barth was on the side that he couldn't know anything about God, about Christianity, about religion, without the revelation of God in Jesus Christ, in Scripture, and in the preaching of Scripture. Bruner, on the other hand, said that there was a light in nature which made it unavoidable to say, here we have a God. Well, now, Lord Gifford was on the side of those who said that you could discover faith in a revelation-free manner, just using human reason and observation of the world around you. Now, the Gifford lectures have been established in 1887, 1889, and there have been just a plethora of famous world figures, not simply in the world of theology and philosophy, but world figures who have given these lectures. Just a random selection from the different lectures at Edinburgh, and those who had also interesting people speak. But the different lectures in Edinburgh, some of the luminaries would be Alfred North Whitehead, John Dewey, Albert Schweitzer, Reinhold Niebuhr, Niels Bohr, the physicist Arnold Toynbee, Rudolf Bultmann, Iris Murdoch, interestingly, Yuri Bultmann, Hannah Arendt, and Noam Chomsky. And more recently, and this is just a little bit of local color, the Davidson alumnus by the name of Holmes Ralston, who was one of the most prominent ecological philosophers in the world, gave the different lectures about 23 years ago. I was very interested in that because Holmes Ralston received the stipend for giving those lectures, which through the largesse of the Templeton Foundation, which is really kind of financed Lord Gifford's original establishment, Holmes had about $1.5 million he didn't know what to do with. And I was teaching religion at Davidson at the time, and called up and said, I'm going to establish a chair of religion at Davidson College on science and religion. And I said, oh, that's great. He said, well, I got $1.5 million put into it. Who do I talk to? I was able immediately to pass it on to somebody else. And we now have a Ralston professorship at Davidson. Well, now, let's move on to the different lectures of James himself, which is the purpose of these 3 weeks. The Gifford lectures, as I said earlier to you, was one of the first widely read books in an entirely new discipline, the approach to religion as a psychological phenomenon. And I also said to you, the sensation when it was published is almost unbelievable. If you look back, 21 editions in the first 10 years. In the book, he is heavily dependent on materials which were collected by others. And although he knows those things very carefully, the fact of the matter is that this is a kind of a patchwork that he puts together around a framework of ideas that he has as kind of a standard by which he judges these things. And one of the reasons I enjoy teaching this is so many of the things that you see in different lectures, really more or less for the first time, are things that continue to be important in our minds as we think about how you look at the psychological dimensions of religion today. In particular, as he depended upon materials collected by others, there was E.D. Starbuck, who was a pioneer psychologist who taught at Stanford, was one of the people to whom he turned regularly. He did annotate everything he said, but many of the examples that he uses in the life of religious experience are taken directly from a collection of such things that Starbuck had written many years earlier. It has been commented that the style of this home tree is, let's say the word turgid at best, because maybe it was written as lectures and really was not edited. It just came out as he spoke it, as far as we know. So it's kind of hard to read. And when I gave you this set of quotation marks, I've been advised by my counselor But I need to try to translate some of these things as we go along. So we'll have that right now. First of all, one of the really remarkable things about the variety of religious experience was, after having cleared away some of the groundwork, underbrush, let's say, in which he was trying to deal with some of the common misconceptions of what he saw as psychology of religion, such things as religion is no more than some sort of a sexual fantasy, or religion is no more than some sort of neurosis or some kind of psychological imbalance. He was trying to say this is more a common experience for all of humanity. And he gives his first definition of religion. Religion, he says, is the feelings, acts, and experiences of individuals in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine. Now, that brings about the first question that I want to talk about for about 5 minutes as you and your group together. First question is, how do you relate to that definition? Think about it again, and let's read it again. Feelings, acts, and experiences of individuals in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider divine. Now, how do you react to that definition? Is it an adequate definition? And what's left out if you think it's inadequate? So talk about that for about 5 minutes with the other two brothers. We'll take about one more minute. One more minute.
So I guess it's.
All right. Let's go back together, please. I did. This is just like taking your class outdoors for a session. Well, what you got? Anybody want to throw in an idea that came up?
It just has men. Hello.
Yeah, I tried to bracket that. Yeah, I did.
And solitude, because where's community?
Yeah,
Where's congregation?
Okay. That's good. It's all
It seemed to me he's talking about it as being a very individual experience.
Absolutely.
And that, this is his definition of it. And we talked about the question of what is spirituality versus religion, and how does that factor into this? I don't know the answer to that.
Well, you know, I think at the time it was written, the two have been more or less synonymous, religious and spiritual. But I don't know, nowadays it's been quite something different. That's a good point. What else you hear?
There's no scripture because scripture is the influence. Of
Absolutely, no authority outside, either scripture or, as in some traditions, the passing on the generation like in the Catholic Church, the preaching of theological things. It's not there.
And I like, it didn't rule out that there's a greater power, a creator, but it also didn't say that's for sure. It was kind of like, where do you think you are in relation to the divinity?
Yeah, that's right.
Is religion the same thing as a relationship with God? Because in solitude, that's often where we have that quietness, we can reflect, we can go deep, we can experience thoughts, feelings, and so on,
Yeah.
that we may not be able to in a crowd.
And may not really be able to articulate sometimes, talk, yeah. And we're going to come back to that with mysticism. Yeah. Anything else? Well, I think you put your finger on most of the potential liabilities in this. It is definite on William James' part. This is what I'm going to do. But there's some other parts of the religious landscape, let's say, that he doesn't want to deal with. And so as you read the book, you go over and over and over, this is this person, this person, this person. No sense of community, no sense of, again, and this is in context of different lectures, no sense necessarily of any kind of transcendency. It's to God, whoever you think is God. What's your ultimate commitment? So it's got its limitations, but it really lends itself to a very interesting essay that he does, extended essay on this. Now, the method and scope of what he's doing in this project is, he says, quote, scientific. That is to say, I think it's empirical. It's an analysis of things that are before you, and you try to figure out what they are. So instead of, he's trying to bring some sort of scientific regimen to what he's trying to do. And the way he does it, and we'll see in the next two lessons particularly, the way he does it is set up some categories, which in retrospect we look at and we think, oh yeah, well that's sure, that's right, we all know that. But James is the one who kind of focused in on these things and made them a part of our common language. We'll come to just one of those before we end the day. But most of what he uses in terms of his evidence for his scientific study are memoirs or stories about saints that come from the past. They are, despite the fact that he's trying to cast a very broad net, they are for the most part Christian. They are for the most part Protestant Christian. They are for the most part things that are extracted from a larger work. Somebody is giving his or her testimony about this has happened in my life, and he takes that and tries to put it into these categories which he developed. So what we're looking at here is a kind of an exclusive approach. We know what he's going to do. He told us in the definition, and then he goes forward and does it. Now, a couple of other quotes here that I won't ask you to sit together and worry about too much, but let's read them before we go further. First one is, the essence of religious experiences, the thing by which we must finally judge them, must be that element of yeah, I got it. Or quality which we can meet nowhere else. Now, it's here in the context of this. He starts from an analogy from physiology, and he says, when you do a physiology, you find an organ that does something for the organism that nothing else can do, and that's the essence. And he said the same thing with religion, with that element that we cannot meet anywhere else. So for him, the situation is a very discrete experience that somebody has that you can't deal with adequately except call it religious. And the next thing he does, his third quote, I thought was very interesting. He said, if we look at man's whole mental life as it exists, we have to confess that the part of which rationalism can give an account is relatively superficial. If you have intuitions at all, they come from a deeper part of your nature than the loquacious level which rationalism has. What's he doing? Yeah, okay. He relegates the use of reason apart from the experience itself as being secondary. In other words, I think maybe I don't think he's going against what Lord Gifford wanted with natural theology, but what he's saying is, you know, if you try to rationalize these things, you're doing a different enterprise. You're doing theology, maybe. You're not doing the spiritual essence of what your life is. So, what we're looking at here is a situation in which rationalism is put on kind of it's second to this kind of empirical investigation of people's religious lives. Now, in this particular work, as we'll see later on as we move on the next 2 weeks, if any of you ever come back, will be the fact that he, and we'll touch on this first just a little bit before we end today, he believes that there is an inherent predisposition on our parts concerning our view of the world, our outlook on life. We'll come back to that in just a few minutes. The other major emphasis, of which we'll speak on the following 2 occasions, is conversion, which is a major factor in his particular exploration of religious psychology. And then we're going to talk about saintliness and mysticism at the end of our time together. So that's where we're going to be going primarily. But for today, the next thing we want to do is talk about the fact that for William James at least, there are 2 sorts of people. I always shy away from anybody who says there are 2 sorts of people. I read an essay once in which the guy was convinced that the world is divided into 2 sorts of people, the leaders and the leadees. But for William James, the 2 sorts of people are healthy-minded and morbid-minded, if you will. Sometimes, and more commonly, this is spoken of as being once born and twice born eventually. So here we have these 2 quotations that talk about the 2 different ways of looking at life. And before I get you to talk about these 2 quotations I'm giving you, I want to read you just, if I can make this thing work, I want to read you just a brief paragraph or so about the difference between the sick soul, as he calls it, and the healthy soul. With regard to the healthy soul, the optimistic person, he talks about several quotes, but primarily he gives a wonderful quote from Edward Everett Hale, who was a Unitarian minister in Boston. Listen to how he describes his religious life. I observe with profound regret the religious struggles which come into many biographies as if almost essential to the formation of the hero. I also speak of these to say that any man has the advantage not to be estimated who is born, as I was, into a family where the religion is simple and rational, who is trained in the theory of such religion so that he never knows for an hour what these religious or irreligious struggles are. I always knew that God loved me, and I was grateful to him for the world he placed me in. I always like to tell him so and was glad to receive his suggestions to me. I can remember perfectly that when I was coming to manhood, the half-philosophical novels of the time had a deal to say about the young men and babies who were facing, quote, the problem of life. I had no idea whatever what that problem was. To live with all my might seemed to be easy, to learn where there was so much to learn where there's so much to learn seemed pleasant, and almost, of course, to lend a hand if one had a chance natural. And if one did this, why he enjoyed the life because he could not help it, and without proving to himself that he ought to enjoy it. A child who is early taught that he is God's child, that he may live and move and have his being in God, and that he has therefore infinite strength in the hand for the conquer of any difficulty, will take life more easily, and will probably make more of it than one who is told he is born a child of wrath, and wholly incapable of good. Now, this is the first of the options. This is the person who has no need of anything more than what is innate to his life. He's once born. On the other hand, the sick soul is entirely different sort of personality. The sick soul, for example, this is a quote from John Bunyan. I thought, now I grow worse and worse. Now I'm farther from conversion than I ever was before. If now I should have been burned at the stake, I could not believe that Christ had love for me. Alas, I could neither hear him, nor see him, nor feel him, nor savor any of his sayings. Sometimes I would tell my condition to the people of God, which, when they heard, they would first pity me and would tell me of the promises. But they had told me that I must reach for the Son with my finger, as had bidden me to receive or rely upon the promises. Yet this while, as the act of sinning, I never was more tender than now. I durst not take a pen or stick, but so big as a straw, for my conscience now was sore and was smart at every touch. I could not tell how to speak my words, for fear I should misplace them. Oh, how gingerly did I then go, and all that I did and said, I found myself as on a miry bar that shook if I did but stir, and was there left by both Christ, God and Christ and the Spirit and all good things. But my origin, original and inward pollution, that was my plague and my affliction. Now, the contrast there between these two ideas. But at any rate, I want us to read together these last two quotations, and then I want to get the root again and just spend a minute or two with it. And that is, the once born and the twice born. Now, the first quote, these two are James' writing. This is not from someone else. The first one, as you see, is, it is to be hoped that we all have found some friend, and by the way, the lips is there, and it has to be some friend, probably female and probably a young female, but anyway. Some friend whose soul is of a sky blue tint, whose affinities are rather with flowers and birds and all enchanting innocencies than with the dark of human passions, who can think no ill of man or God, and in whom religious madness, being in possession from the outset, needs no deliverance of any antecedent burden. That would be Edward Hale, among others. Now, in contrast with the healthy-minded view stands a radically opposite view, a way of maximizing evil based on the persuasion that evil aspects of life are at the very essence, and that the world's meaning most comes home to us when we lay them most to heart. Okay, questions here that I want you to talk about in your groups of 5 minutes or so. One of, I guess, is question of nature versus nurture, if we can just bring it down to simple terms. In other words, is this an innate quality in a person to be this kind of once born, happy-go-lucky Edward Hale sort of person? And the same thing true on the other side of the ledger with the John Bunyan? Or is this something which is nurtured in the person through the life that he lives in the environment with other people? So those two things, first of all, and then secondly, if you're willing to talk with your group buddies about this, where do you stand on the spectrum? One being the most pessimistic of all, one being the most optimistic of all as far as religious experience is concerned. Where are you coming there? Are you a 1 or 3 or 5 or 9? Where are you on that spectrum? And secondly, talk about 2 or 3 people you know. Don't have to name them if you don't want to, but talk about where they're on the spectrum, because we're all different on this. So, back into the groups again, deal with these 2 questions if you will. It's always good. The word, word that you get to Secondly, are we taught more than we have instinctively, yeah, those are affected by their relationship. Is it spirituality or is it developing? Yeah, and that maybe, to me, it's still there, something maybe needed, which is definitely. But, you know, I think the answer is that, and you kind of Christian, that's the only natural theology. Take that one more minute, about one more minute, please.
I'm saying the
One being.
But I can't help but think about people who are clinically depressed. They're looking forward
Okay, let's put that together, please. All right. Everybody who's a one, raise your hand. No. What came out of this for you all in the conversation?
We're all healthy-minded.
Way to go. I knew the back row would be without any doubt. They say we're all healthy minded.
Well, we talked about the fact that it's nature and nurture, that you can't say it's one or the other, it's a degree. But also the idea that, you know, I've got family members that have been diagnosed as bipolar or severe depression and
Yeah.
anxiety, and that's an element of who they are and how they see the world, but it's not something they learned in their home.
Yes. Well,
We talked about a profound shift that many of us feel in the current political environment toward a sense of deep helplessness and hopelessness.
so external effects is anything. Yeah.
John, not all of us are that bad.
Minority report, Frank, what you got? Frank? Frank, what?
Right here, it's all my reading glasses, so.
It makes you a 10 or a 1, I don't know. Now, by the way, I put this in as kind of an on-off switch, but it's definitely not. It's a spectrum. And it's also, we're moving targets on that spectrum as far as I experience. I hope you feel the same way. But there is really a difference in attitude toward life. And it comes perhaps from people in different seasons in different ways. But it's pretty good insight. Anything else you saw? What about your friends that you estimated at Central? Were you talking more about people that were very positive, or were you talking about people being negative? Both?
Well, I talked about my brother who's raised in the same house that I was, but he's 180 degrees different, you know, pretty much everything.
Mm-hmm.
So that argues for nurture, I guess.
It does. It sure does.
I have two friends that hate the fall. They just go into such a state of depression in the fall. They think of it as, you know, the leaves are dying and coming off the trees.
Yeah.
Guys are crazy.
I have a little of that myself. You know, here's spoiler alert, James is much more interested in, the sick soul, the morbid person, than he is in the person who sees all sweetness and life. He tries to make them balance in some ways, the way he describes them, and he picks people and events and occasions on the positive side of the ledger and says, you know, this is real for these people. But he's much more engaged on the morbidity of life in terms of religious experience and how that is possible to change. Another thing, and this is kind of a spoiler alert always to me, is in the chapters on the sick soul, James does two little autobiographical passages anonymously because he sees himself in that category. And the next step that comes always is a step toward trying to figure out how this divided self can be reintegrated and become whole once again. And that's why maybe the most important chapters in this is trying to understand this phenomenon of conversion. Now, once again, pick this up in the religious historical context of America. Ever since Jonathan Edwards in the 1740s, American religion has been driven primarily, American Protestant religion, it will change in terms of population, but American Protestant religion has been driven primarily by this idea that everybody has to be born again, twice born. That's kind of essence of evangelical revival. And every generation up until the time of James has been one salient event where the whole population is at least influenced, if not changed, by the fact that here comes a revivalist, here comes George Whitfield, or here comes Charles Grandison Finney, or here comes Dwight Moody. All these things fall in categories. So American religion has been kind of synonymous with twice born up to this time. And he's trying to expand this at the same time, and he's going to look at the fact that you have to have some sort of impetus if you are a divided self who's brought back together in this life. So really, next week when we talk, we're going to be talking about conversion primarily, and I think that's part of the nucleus of this whole thing as far as William James is concerned. Now, next category on this is, would that be the same today or not? I'm sure don't know the answer to that. Well, that's about what I've got for this week. You all got some other things we'll talk about what we read. Questions, comments?
One of the things that we were saying is that we felt that both were important, that you go through the dark night of the soul and you come through, but that gives you a depth of being that just being all sweetness and flowers doesn't give you. And so we will recognize the importance of both.
Yeah. What's the importance of sweetness and flowers?
What's the importance of
sweetness and flowers?
Those are very important, but there are many times in life where you don't have sweetness and flowers.
Uh-huh.
And then it's a matter of dealing with that. If we're all trying to live with sweetness and flowers, we haven't developed a depth of soul.
Okay. Good. Anything else?
I never thought reading this, that he was writing in time before we had 150 years of research.
Exactly.
And now, you know, MRI, blah, blah, blah. And yet, I also have a sense that when I go back and read Little Women, and I think about those characters, like Joe, for example. I mean, these days we would have said, well, she's clearly meant to be trans. Or Beth, which clearly had an anxiety disorder, but it also sticks out to me that we lose something. We lose a lot, I think, by taking those personalities and lumping them into diagnostic categories, whereas in the time of James, they would be thought about, I think, in a much more nuanced and tender and accepting way, with richness of personality as opposed to what we do nowadays, which is diagnosis.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and I was reading this, the term became the ever again, the term primitive. But that's not a bad thing necessarily. This means that it's more basic to the essentials of life than subsequently. So it's what James is doing is a pretty blunt instrument, and given 100 and some odd years of psychology, it really does appear to be kind of a blunt instrument. It nevertheless has its own value because it sets up as you say, the nuances of human personality. You need to consider that. Well, thank you all, and we'll do this something next week.
Should we keep these, bring these back next week?
No, I'm gonna give you some more.
Oh, we'll get more next week. Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Where did you
Hey, guys.
So where are you? Are you a 1 or a 10, bud?
James had to leave, and this is the churches. I'm just gonna put end stream.
You need
I think that